Got 2 eyes, so she doesn't use 2 of them.
Yeah.
All right, John, talk and let's see if I hear you.
Okay, first of all, it appears as I'm looking around that Bill has done a good job of letting you know that this is the book we're going to use as our sort of centerpiece. We'll jump off of it, but it's part of the centerpiece of what we'll be doing. And what you just got is a study guide, part of a study guide that goes with it. It's for part 1. There's 4 parts to the book, so I'll stand by parts. That way, you don't have to try to remember the thing forever. I'll just keep bringing you more. So anyway, the study guide was not produced by J.P. Moreland, who is the author of the book, but it's a teaching assistant that worked with him for years. And so he knows him very well and adapts it. This is mostly for you. I may at times follow what's in here, but I won't always. So what it does though is it gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that can come from each of these sections. And we'll be talking about that in a moment, but that's very much the way this whole thing is going to go. It's a discussion, Socratic style type thing. And so it's just always useful when you're reading to have some questions to get you thinking about it as you're reading it. And those are all things that we'll talk about. Okay, so are we operational?
You're good.
Okay.
Silence the phones, no kidding.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And Bill, if you could you open in prayer for us, please?
Yes, well, Father, we just thank you for this opportunity to come together and to really build your kingdom by renewing our minds through your word. And we just pray for your presence and your grace, your enlightenment. And we just pray that this would bear much fruit for your glory and kingdom. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, a little bit of background. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but just a little bit of background. I've been in education for 50 years, so I've been doing this for a long time. Actually, I started off originally teaching in the lab instructor in the biology department at Biola University in Southern California. Didn't earn enough money. And so, because I only had a part-time job, so I needed to have a full-time job. I had, as a student, worked in the facilities area for a couple of the summers. And so I saw a supervisor position open, give it a try. So I applied for it and convinced them that if I could teach 50 high school college students in a lab, I could probably supervise some folks, and they bought it. And so, in a way, the journey went. And I spent the next 15 years in facilities. I ended up spending about 8 of those years in charge of the whole facility for Biola University. And it was a great experience. It was a great place to work. As a lot of the people that worked for me were students. That's very normal in a college environment. You have a lot of, and we were, as the facilities people, were the largest student employer on the campus. And so we worked with a lot of them. We treated students, I came to find out, quite differently than others, in that they were just workers. They were people who worked. They didn't have any special status. They were there expected to work. Found out that that wasn't always what everybody expected. But so we had the whole structure. We had, you could grow over several years because we spent all of our time and money training them all the time. So if we could hold on to them, that would be a good idea. So but we noticed a thing over the years that as students were coming to us from the high schools to work and be at Biola, there was a change happening in them. And I got to the point that basically I said to people who were out interviewing, find somebody who worked on a farm. Okay, they at least normally have an idea of what a work ethic is. The rest of these folks, we have to spend so much time trying to get them to understand what it means to be clean, to clean something, or to work hard, or to do. And they were fun to talk to. I enjoyed talking to them, but they just really weren't really great workers. my nature has always been, this is for any of you that know me, which only a couple of you here do, but I ask questions. And it's not just in a classroom, I just ask questions all the time. And one of the questions I was asking was, what's going on? What's happening? There's something deeper here than just change in culture. There's something more. And I normally stick myself in the middle of a thing. I don't like to just watch from the outside. I sort of like to jump in the middle and try it out and see. I had originally wanted to teach and taught. I tried to approach management like it was teaching, but my first love since I was probably little was to teach things, and I just love doing that. And so finally I reached the point where I took some classes, I interacted with the education department at Biola, I talked to people, and I wasn't getting answers. It didn't seem like the educational world, even the Christian educational world, was doing something or grasped that this change coming from students was happening. And so I finally started. It took a little bit of time because I can be extremely stubborn, and I won't get into that part of the story, but the Lord had to whack me over the head with a 2x4 3 or 4 times to get my attention. But finally, I did, and the long journey ended up teaching at a Christian school in Apple Valley, California. It was, initially I was just talking to them. It was a friend of mine that was working there and wanted me to come and talk with them. I didn't grasp that they were actually interviewing me. and then when they, you have some interesting ideas. Why don't you come and talk to our board? Oh, okay. So I talked to the board, and then they offered me a contract. And sorry, this is lack of nobility time. I saw the contract, and I go, oh, well, thank you very much. I really wasn't trying to apply for a job. I already have one. But thank you. Then I went home and I laughed and I said, nobody works for that low amount of money. It is just almost nothing, you know? And so the Lord had to get another 2x4 out, and over the next couple months whacked me over the head yet again. And fortunately for me, I have a much more perceptive wife than I am. And she said, you know, you're never going to be satisfied unless you go back into the classroom and find out what's going on. And you being you, you're not going to be satisfied teaching somewhere other than a Christian school. I've been working at a public school, and you earn more money, but it wasn't fun at all. Sorry for any of you that work in public schools. My great,
It's okay.
I salute you. But yeah, I mean, I was fine. And so I called them up and I thought I was safe. I called them up like a day before school started and said, well, you know, I know you probably have everything all working fine, but just in case there's any last minute need or something, I would be willing to come and work there. Silence on the phone for literally a couple minutes. I said, wow, that's really interesting. Could you be here for a meeting at 1 o'clock in the morning? And I, well, sure. And so I came over and walked in, and they put a schedule in front of me that had my name in it. And apparently something had just happened administratively. There had been a change, and there was, for any of you that have worked in Christian schools, the last guy in gets the smorgasbord of classes, and that was what was a schedule of a smorgasbord of classes. I was teaching everything from Bible to English to history to a couple computer science classes. It was just all over the place, middle school and high school. And that started the journey, which went on for 32 more years. I loved it. Mid-year of that first year, or Christmas break, and I was still just trying to figure which way was up and which way was down. just because you've been in college management for 15 years does not mean you know how to operate in a classroom. You think you do until you actually get there, and it's way harder than you think it is. The administrator called and said, "Oh, our high school science teacher, it just left. Her husband accepted a pastor position in the Midwest, and they're leaving, and we don't have a teacher for second semester." I was looking at your syllabus, your syllabus resume, and you've done a lot of stuff. I was a biological science major, chemistry minor, worked in biological research in the Army, all this kind of stuff. And you've done a bit of science. Yeah. How would you like to be the high school science teacher second semester? So that meant, well, I thought about it for a bit, and then I go, okay, I'll give it a try. So all the classes that I'd spent one semester trying to figure out how to do, now we're done. I had to start all over again in the middle of the year to figure out how to do those classes. By the end of the first semester, I had concluded that what we were doing curricular-wise wasn't working. It may have been what lots of Christian schools were doing, but it just didn't work. So I'd done a bunch of research and presented it to the administrator and said, that's interesting stuff. I should have gotten this MO down, but why don't you come and present to the board? Oh, okay. So I went and presented to the board, and they said, that's interesting. Yep, do it. So then I had to research the books, and I had to get it. I not only had to figure out myself how to do this, but I had to train a couple of the teachers to do it, and then the world of curriculum director and all that kind of stuff launched, and away we went. Our journey, the first 10 years I was in the sciences, and good things happened, but there wasn't the kind of effect that I really wanted to see happen. We really weren't getting inside kids and starting to change who they were as persons. They liked the classes. We were solely developing good students, but it wasn't really working the way I had hoped it would work. And so I started asking a bunch of questions, and the first thing I discovered was some materials from Summit Ministries and worldview type materials, which I wasn't familiar with. And I researched that and go, this makes a tremendous amount of sense. And so we experimented with that, trying to figure out what it meant. Then my oldest daughter graduated from our high school, and she decided to go to Biola University. And they contacted her, and they were starting a brand new program called the Torrey Honors Program. And it was a classical Christian great books honors program on the college level. And they contacted her because she had done really well in the SAT and straight A student and all that kind of stuff. And I remember going down to the presentation with her, and my goodness, this is interesting stuff they're saying here. And then literally to demonstrate what they were talking about, this was Dr. Reynolds, if anybody knows him, but he was making the presentation. They brought a class that was in session, and they brought it down, stuck it up on the stage of this auditorium, and let it just keep going. They'd acted like we were not even there. This was right at the end of the school year, and they were they were discussing and questioning and alert and alive. And I had just spent 10 years working with high school students, and they are not normally like that. This is unusual. But then I looked down the row a little bit, and there was my daughter, and she was out on the edge of her chair. It was like, I've been looking for something like this for a long time. And so she applied and got accepted, and her journey through that program was sort of my education on what classical Christian was about. I would ask her gobs of questions. Why are you reading this? What are these books about? What are you learning? All of these things. And about the same time, Biola started a master's program in apologetics. And I really liked what I saw. Plus it gave me an opportunity, even though we lived a couple hours away, to drive down once a week and visit my daughter. So I did that. Crazy. And I went through this program, and the combination of apologetics thought and the way they did it, and worldview thinking started to change the way I looked at things. That then, sort of the third part was this classical Christian idea, what it is. Okay, and as those pieces started to weave together, I eventually went back and presented to, which was a different administrator at this time, but the idea of we need to try a different thing. And I, way back then, even called it the integrated project. I didn't know what I meant. Just it's a cool word. But anyway, it was, we decided that students needed to experience things in a manner where the pieces fit together. That part of the reason that the kind of learning that I was hoping for, I wanted to see happen, that needed to happen in students, wasn't happening, is because we were approaching the academic process in a bunch of pieces. For any of you remember school, you know, first period, second period, third period, fourth period, you turn on your first period brain, you then walk out, turn that brain off, turn on the second period brain, turn that one off, go to the third, and so on. And what that does over the years in its various forms is produces the thinking in a student or in a person that they look at things as bits and pieces. They don't even consider that things could connect, that things are related, that wholes. And even though the New Testament talks about that we are to become complete, or that we are to become whole, or to become like Jesus Christ, and we talk those words, I discovered that we really don't exactly know what they mean. And definitely don't have an idea of how it's going to happen. It is just something that seems to happen to some people and some people not. And I call it, Bill has heard this many times from me, I didn't come from Missouri, but I have sort of taken the phrase that I come from Missouri, you gotta show me. I just to hear the words isn't good enough. Or you could probably say it's more accurate that I was science trained, and so I've got to see data to support the idea that how does this work? How do you produce whole people? How does it happen? Is there a process that you can use, that you can connect to the learning side of the thing? And where does learning fit in? And why do some kids in class learn and some don't necessarily learn? And why do they mostly forget? And you know, all of these things, which if you've been around schools or taught or whatever, you probably ask yourself all the time. And that was the kind of stuff that I was trying to get into. And our first thought was, how do these pieces fit? And we wanted to approach classes, we wanted to try to get a class to connect. So if we could, as teachers, connect a class in the way we taught it, maybe the connecting process would have an effect on the way kids thought. That was the primitive form of this way back when. And tried that, we tried all kinds of things. We really started to get more deeply into what classical Christian meant as a school, and slowly transitioned into becoming a classical Christian school. I got involved in school accreditation and did that for over 20 years, and so I was trained to take schools apart, and ultimately chaired a number of teams, and learned a lot in studying different schools and what works and what doesn't, and all of that kind of thing. And always I tried to keep myself in the classroom, because that's my first love. And I wanted to try to do these things I was reading about. It's nice to read them, they sound really good, but remember I'm from Missouri, and you gotta show me. I want to see an effect in a kid. I want to see something happen. Okay, and that was the later years. It was sort of our high point as a school in Apple Valley, where things started to click. What we'll give it a generic title, life change started to occur. Kids started to take what we were doing in class and take it with them outside of class and go have discussions at Starbucks and go have discussions with their parents. And we would get feedback oh man, my daughter's graduating this year. That's sad. It's sad that she's graduating, but we're glad she's finally made it. But what we're gonna miss is all of these crazy discussions that we had over the dinner table at night. You know, we've been doing this for the last several years, and this has really been good stuff. And what that was now, okay. And now we'll weave in the book. J.P. Moreland asked some questions, and if you had a chance to start reading in that, you see them right at the beginning. And they sound sort of obscure to begin with. But the more I thought about them and the more I tested them, and then we came up with the grand idea to have a philosophy class at our school and discussed, that became one of the great places for me to learn as I discussed with students and tried these ideas, and things happened that as a result, discussion, Socratic style learning produces a different effect. Surprise. Now, for any of you that are familiar with classical, yeah, you just finally absorbed what they learned for 2,000 years and did it. But, you know, I mean, yay for me. I finally learned. Remember, I need 2x4s to learn things. And the more we discussed, the more change happened in students. The more we connected ideas together and tried to get them to both in discussion, and then it translated into writing type assignments, whether it be a quiz or an essay or whatever. The more they did that, the more life of the mind started to happen. And it wasn't life of the mind, okay, here you are, person, and I'm going to present a really hard thing for you to learn. And if you have a life in your mind, if you are going to work hard at this, you will finally get what I'm saying. Yay for you. And it doesn't work really well. It works some. And if you really beat up on them, they can kind of learn. But it doesn't really work as well. Then, we'll call it the theory stuff started to kick in. What is Moreland talking about in this book? Okay, love your God with all your mind. Okay, I get that. I get the idea. I thought I did. And then he starts off, and we'll sort of start off with that here, by asking a question that's obscure. And I used to have fun once I got the hang of how he did it. I started doing it in classes, and it was a learning experience. The range of responses. So you get to participate in that. Okay, you get to be part of that now. Okay. And Sheila, since I know you, you're going to be the first one I ask. And in a sense, if you think about it, if you did have a chance to look at the book, he sort of asks the question, what is an intellectual? Sheila, what's an intellectual?
We tend to think of an intellectual as someone just who has a lot of like smarts. You know, they know a lot of things, know a lot of facts, I would say is what we generally tend to think. Someone who knows a lot of information about a particular subject.
Okay. Now, go ahead and play the game for a few minutes and then we'll let some others participate. Okay, do we generally, culturally, I know we don't want to speak for the culture, that's always a challenge in the first place, but do we have a positive view of an intellectual or a more not so sure about it?
I'd say not so sure.
Okay. Why do you think that's the case?
I think because they tend to not look at the whole picture, and they usually tend to leave God out of it. And so it's very just fact-based, and there's no, impossibilities that can happen, or there's nothing that can intervene. It's just line upon line, and that's all it is. There's nothing else that can be in it.
Okay, let's, some others. Eventually, the format of this, I will never, it's not my goal to make you uncomfortable, except for Sheila, I'll make her. It is, so don't panic if the idea of discussing in class is something that is uncomfortable to you. The goal here is not to be uncomfortable. It's more a matter of, on one side, the time goes faster and you have a better chance of staying awake if you actually get involved in the discussion. Okay, I've had a number of students who have figured that out, and so that's why they get involved in the discussion. And I've had a number that have never figured that out. I say, man, that was the longest class. And some other students look at it and say, the longest class? Man, I didn't want it to stop. We were just finally getting going and figuring this out, and why did it stop? And you go, how can you have both going on at the same time? Well, that's some stuff of mystery. But the biggest issue is if you get involved, whether you talk or not, but try to track what's going on, follow the discussion, it will help a lot. And also it gets it sort of sticking in your head because you probably most of the time will not be completely satisfied or agree with some of the stuff we talk about, so you take it outside of class. And one of the things that I say to classes from the beginning and try really hard, I will tell them, a classroom is just where we begin the process of learning. It is, the real learning happens outside of class. At best, as a teacher, for the science types out there, I'm a catalyst. I enter into a reaction to try to get it going, but I then pull back out of the reaction, and the final product really doesn't have a whole lot to do with me. Okay, it is, we had a group, probably at our high point as a school in Apple Valley. It passed through several generations of students over about a decade and a half, but a group way back when started having a discussion at what was then the brand new Starbucks. And on Thursday nights, because I always gave a quiz on Friday, so it was they figured out that talking about quizzes helped because they were essay quizzes. They never knew exactly what I was going to ask. And so they would go quiz each other, and so that would prepare them to get ready for the quiz. And so a few of them would say, well, let's just meet at Starbucks and we'll sort of study a bit for the quiz the next day. And they did really well in the quizzes. So here's the way things start with students. If they did really well and they're going there, there must be something about the coffee or something that gets you getting a good grade. It could be nothing to do with studying. It has to do with the coffee. Okay, and so a few more people joined them. And pretty soon, the more that they had, they created this group that they literally passed from generation of students to generation of students literally over a decade. It meant I found out from some adults that ended up talking to me about it was there were adults that had observed this and came on Thursday nights to have their mocha frappuccino and listen to these kids talk. And they were coming, they came every week. They said, it's the most interesting thing I have ever heard. It's far better than TV. It is just, this is, and they were coming to hear, and they were so into the discussions, they didn't even notice it was the same people periodically that were there. And they got so they could pull in freshmen and sophomores. It was the juniors and seniors who were taking the lead, but there would be the energetic ones who figured out it was the coffee also, that if they went there, they would get good grades too, like those people did. And so they would come to the class, and away they went. And I said, okay, what you guys have discovered is there's where learning is happening. Okay, if something we did in class fed that, yay. If the motivation to do well on the quiz helped you, yay. But the learning is something that you are driving yourself as you're discussing this. And for the quiz, the teacher types out there, well, did that mean that all of them came in on the essays and they all said the same thing the next day? Amazingly not. They did not. You could see little strands where obviously they had been talking with each other. I expected that. But their minds would go off in different directions. in the way they would interact with the questions. And it was great fun. So the net effect is, the philosophy class led the way. I sort of wrapped it in, we eventually wrapped it into science classes, which was a real challenge. But we did it. Is that if we can talk about this and we push our minds in the direction of not just being able to give information, but to connect ideas. We're connecting ideas. And the more we connect ideas, now think about it for a second, what are we doing? We're practicing the process of putting pieces together. Okay, and now, be philosophy types for a moment, there's two working definitions for truth. One is when we get the idea in our head that matches the way things really are, and we'll play with that definition a number of different ways. But when our thinking matches reality, okay? So in other words, it's based on an objective thing outside of us. We can have our own views of things, but that doesn't change. I can think I can fly because I've watched The Matrix a bunch of times, okay? But if I go try it, I'm probably gonna go splat, okay? I can't change the way reality works, okay? The other is, less commonly shows up in philosophy books, is called the cohesive theory of truth. And that is that different truths are cohesive. Okay, what's the fancy? You don't use those big words in class to begin with. Eventually you get them to use those, but not to begin with. They're sticky. Okay, and that means that truthful ideas stick. Now think about that. The more truthful ideas that stick, what are you engaging in? A shattered soul becoming whole. You're thinking that's becoming more complete. You're actually engaging in an activity that helps repair or transform or renew your soul. And it's particularly renewing the mind, like Romans 12:1 and 2 talks about. Okay, and so that's what a discussion is. It's not to try to make you uncomfortable, but it is, I love it because I know, I've just been at this a long time, I know I will learn from you all. Okay, and I look forward to that. And I'm always learning more, learning different things about all of this, seeing it from a different perspective. And that's more ideas being connected and glued together, more wholeness happening, and that's my desire. I want to grow up. Okay, now let's go back to Sheila's question. Okay, let's make it open. Do you agree or do you disagree with her perception of what an intellectual is? Yes.
I want to make sure I understand what she said, so I may rephrase it differently, but so you were saying that people distrust intellectuals because they have heard something from outside themselves and it's actually somewhat artificial in their lives. It's something from outside in, whereas people tend to trust your feelings or what you have internalized at more. Is that what
No,
you're
not
getting
necessarily.
at?
I mean, yes, you have to trust facts, and I'm more
Well,
of a
what
science
are the
math
facts?
person,
Yeah.
so I want the fact upon fact. But they don't tend to, like, you go to the doctor and someone says you're sick, you're dying. That's just it. There's no outside whatever. But because I know who God is, and I know that God can intervene and do things, I tend to have that, well, fact is this, but I also know that there's a God who's outside of that, who can heal you. So I think, like from my perspective, I do like the facts, but because of God, I know things aren't always that fact, that someone who doesn't know God or doesn't, who we tend to think of are like intellectuals just in the world, it's just facts upon facts and there's nothing.
Yeah, and I'm looking at not church.
Yeah.
I spent a lifetime
Right.
in the industry, so so God didn't even enter into the discussion, right? But still, people out there are not looking always at facts, they're looking at what does it mean to you,
Right.
kind of thing. And so it's that kind, I'm just trying to fit in what you're saying
Yeah.
and apply it a little bit.
So if we were gonna look at an intellectual, say on a college campus, we're gonna go walk around, okay? If we see okay, I'm talking exaggerated here. We see someone with their head in a book walking into a tree, we would go, oh, there's an intellectual. Okay, I mean, is that kind of the perception that we would get?
No,
Okay,
okay, good.
now, there we go.
Yes.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
You made it so I don't have to ask 3 more questions. Okay, okay.
Exactly.
So now, but let's think about that for a second. An intellectual, in all fairness to that intellectual, knows a bunch of stuff. Okay. But let's think about how the academic process tends to work. In order to become king of the stuff, I have to have narrower and narrower and narrower studies.
Mhm.
So if you ask them about their narrow study, they might be able to give you something useful.
They know more and more about less and less
Right.
until they know everything about nothing.
And that's very much sometimes happens. Now, 2 things occur. Let's think about this. One, we tend to just step back for a moment and think. Does the whole academic process feed this? And what do I mean? Don't we say to kids from kindergarten up, school is about learning stuff, information. And the more you know, the better your grade, the better you are, on and on and on and on. Okay, by high school, you haven't had the wondrous experience of teaching high schoolers. It's probably do that sometime. Okay, and as you teach them in the classroom, they've figured this out. School is just a game. I go to high school for social interaction and athletics, and if I'm an academic type, I take AP honors classes so that I can get into a good college, so that I can study a more narrow thing in college, so that I can get into a graduate program so I can study a more narrow thing, and when I'm done, good riddance. Okay, when I was done with college and went into the Army, my first thought was, I love to read, but now I finally, after years, get to read something I want. Find all the Star Trek books I can and start reading them. You know, I get to finally read something for fun. Okay, I don't want to read any of that stuff for a while. Okay, and then I wouldn't mind it if the while went on for a long time, but eventually the spark started going again. But for a lot of folks, it's, I don't want to read another book in my life. Okay, now think about it. What's something we talk about in education? Trying to produce lifelong learners. We've produced a lifelong skeptic that learning isn't worth anything. Okay. Now, they know that in being an intellectual is somebody who knows a lot about something, and that's good, but we also know they're not really very practically good for much. In everyday life, they don't really help you a lot. Okay, and in fact, we start to form the view in them. Probably nobody ever exactly said this, but they form it. If I want to do anything useful, it's not going to happen at school. School is not the place where I'm going to get that. Okay. Now let's take a step further. If you we're going to play around with this word a lot over time, so we'll keep growing the word. But just to begin with, if you were going to define learning, how would you define it? Be brave, at least for the first time or two. I probably won't draft, except for Sheila. But, and beyond that, but if you don't wanna volunteer, it's fine, but yeah, go ahead.
I'd say it's, gathering enough experience with something to apply it usefully.
Okay, when you say experience, what do you mean?
Well, because I can learn from emotional states, I can learn from books, I can learn from being taught how to do woodworking. There's lots of different ways,
Okay, so there's
avenues of learning, so.
lots of different avenues, but those different avenues add together to equal what?
An ability to use those things in a particular context.
Okay, let's be fancy for a second. What do we often call that? Or channel your Proverbs thinking here for a second. Let's not go there yet.
Okay.
We're gonna go there. So you just jumped to the end.
Sorry.
That's okay. But what you see it in Proverbs over and over again, and then they start talking about wisdom. But they always talk about this other thing first. Knowledge. Knowledge. So, knowledge, would you be willing to associate the word knowledge with that acquisition of things that you have learned?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the acquisition of knowledge, would you be willing to say that it would seem like it's useful to have the stuff? Yet what did we just say? An intellectual is somebody who has a lot of knowledge, but they're not useful. What's the problem?
Can we make a distinction between an academic and intellectual?
We can. It's probably easier to keep the two connected for a while, just because it makes the discussion easier. But eventually, I completely agree with you, you've given a much healthier definition to what knowledge is than just now, because it's certainly not just in the classroom, far from it, actually. Okay, yeah, go
The
ahead.
way that I'm grouping or understanding an intellectual, the way that it's being discussed is, for me, an intellectual who has all this specific knowledge is like a specialist.
Okay,
When you have doctors or you have teachers in education, you want to go to the specialist's class to learn that specific tool or plan or gain that knowledge.
do you ever have any hope that the different specialists will end up agreeing with each other?
In my experience, they do not, so.
Okay, I think
We
interesting.
can hope.
Just an interesting observation.
We can hope.
Let's-
Yeah.
Okay, now, do you think that knowledge and information are the same thing?
No.
Why do you see a difference? What's the difference?
Knowledge implies a certain skill, I think, in using the information.
Okay. Okay. Others want to add to that?
Well, there's a lot of information, we can find information everywhere. But knowledge is absorbing it to the point of understanding and using it.
Okay, good. Now, in our average school situation, do we teach to knowledge or do we teach to information?
To information.
Why do you say that?
Because we have our quotas. I was taught in public school. You have quotas. You have to get them to absorb as much information needed. And your hope is that something sparks in them to be able to want to dig in deeper so that they can apply it, because we're all about testing.
Now, if knowledge, Mel, right? If it's closer to what Mel is saying knowledge is, do information and knowledge match then? Are they the same thing? I know you said no, but I'm trying to get you to talk about it a little bit more.
You're trying to get me to talk about
Yes.
it? I now lost my thought process.
Yeah, scared you to death, right on the spot.
No. I like the way that Chuck said it. He said knowledge is what? Now I already forgot.
It implies skill.
Yes, with information.
So
So
that-
knowledge
So you have some command of it, and you have some command of it later. In other words, I know I'm an intellectual. I know a lot. And how can I prove it? See the piece of paper hanging on the wall? Okay. So I've been there. Okay, I had a student many years ago in the very early times in Apple Valley. He is now an MD, PhD. Great guy. Great guy. When he graduated from our school and went to pre-med, he, I talked with him a lot. I said, okay, you're the first one we're sending out like this. So I come back and talk to him a lot. I need to learn so that we can get better. And we talked a lot to get him ready for this, but he went to Point Loma University, which is a Christian university in Southern California, but they're actually known for their pre-med program. It's a very demanding program. It turns out that if you survive the program, you're probably going to get into a med school somewhere, no problem. Okay, and so he went and they accepted 60 freshmen. So he got the first day of freshman class. We at our school did not do AP. Not because our classes were often on a college level even more demanding than an AP class. But AP, if you really understand what it means, is that somebody else, the Educational Testing Service, designed the curriculum, and you've got to do their curriculum. And we were rebels enough that we didn't want to do that. We didn't think that the Educational Testing Service had it all wired, and we wanted to do things differently. But we wanted to be demanding. We were trying to prepare students. So anyway, I thought, Ben, when you get there, you very well may be, because you're going to be a bunch of really super brights here. You may be the only one there that hasn't had AP classes. So just be ready for it. Be ready for it. That's what that's going to do to you. He said, yeah, I remember that, but it still didn't help a lot because I got there and I was the only person of those 60 that hadn't had not only AP, but probably whether that's Scholar AP or whatever it is, where you have like 12 AP classes you take in high school. It's incredible. And these kids were really sharp. And as he talked with them, they remembered that they had done a lot of different things. Oh, I remember I did that. I remember we studied that. I remember we did that. But as soon as classes got going, they didn't know the stuff. Now, Ben came out of the other and said, they will have tasted things you have not tasted. Because we went the other route. We went the route of you don't know until you really know that you know that you know. You don't know it until you can do it next year and come back and answer these same questions again or deal with this or use this to help you understand this class and all that. In order to learn that way, you have to have time to chew. You have to have time to chew on it, to play with it, to interact with it. And inevitably, the reality is you're not going to cover as much territory. It's just, you're not, the assembly line can't go as far. We have to spend more time on construction. There's more hand construction there. And he said, okay, I remember. You taught me how to think, taught me how to be a student. What we knew science-wise, whether it be physics, chemistry, or biology, we knew it well. And you taught us a work ethic. And you said, study, that's why you're going to college in the first place, is not to know it all ahead of time, but to go study. Okay. By the end of the first semester, half of the 60 had dropped because it was too hard. Ben was being called on to be a tutor for all these AP folks. And the professors recruited him to do research in the summer, and they gave him a job in the summer. Okay. And he remembers talking to her, oh, man, that first semester was brutal, hard. You know, we do that on purpose. We're getting rid of the people who really shouldn't be here. Okay, that's scary. But anyway, and then beyond that, he finally got to know a couple of the professors. I didn't know. I hadn't done as much as they had done. And some of the discussion that went on here, I won't get into all the details of it, really got me thinking. What those professors said to him was, they had done a lot. In some cases, a lot more than you had done. But they didn't know it. Okay. And intellectual, it isn't particularly useful. And therefore, they weren't willing to go pay a price to learn. You knew you didn't know everything, Ben. And you were willing to go study hard. And you figured out ways of beating it and learning it. And you were an excellent student. And then they went on and on about that. And he came back and we had discussions about all of that. And it's got me to try to get this difference. What's the difference between knowledge and information? Okay. I'll just leave that there for you to think about a little bit more. Our educational world has become a world about information. There's so much of it, we have to cover so fast, we've got to do all of this. Somebody at some publishing company has decided that at this grade level you got to get to the end of this book, and so you got to do the end of this book, and then you got to get to the end of the next book, and the end of the next book, and no one ever seems to want to stick a stick in this book and say, why? Or ask the question of, do they really know it? Or is it really changing them as a human being? Are they, in this case, just becoming a better student? No one seems to want to ask the questions. But now, bigger questions. If most all of us in our time go through school like this, almost no matter where you go, okay, what does that reinforce to us about what we think learning is? Just think for a second. I'll throw a couple ideas and then you can certainly try to add to it. Is we've reinforced in their brains, whether they'll say it on the surface or not, that learning isn't particularly valuable. Learning just means doing a thing. Doesn't mean that I actually engage in it. It's probably going to be passive. Okay, it is something that somebody tells to me, an expert says to me, and maybe I gain some expertise and maybe I don't. But it has nothing to do about me becoming a certain kind of person. Learning is about information. But information doesn't have a whole lot to do with what kind of person I am. And as a result, I don't make any connections between any of that. Now I go on and I'm living life. Let's say I'm living life in the church. What am I going to have the tendency to do in church? I'm going to expect this to be all the same. And I'll apologize if I offend anybody here, but we then come up with we don't really expect church to be particularly useful. We don't expect the things that go on. Now, I'll go way out on a limb, but just like I experienced in high school, it was about social events and athletics. That's what I think now learning is about. Okay, not about me actually becoming a different kind of person. That Christianity itself is just about information. That whatever learning I have, I turn it on first period and I turn it off second period. So whatever was Christian when I was at church doesn't relate to when I'm at work or when I'm with friends or when I'm doing this or when I'm doing that or when I'm making decisions in my family or doing whatever. They're just not connected. Everyone all knows that. We've spent years and years of education teaching us that that's the way life works. And we in the church want folks to change. We want them to experience the life and dynamic that is knowing Jesus Christ and having Him shaped in you. And yet we default to using the same methodology that is we've experienced in all the educational times. And I just throw this out at the beginning, think about that. And I think we could take it into business training, we could take it into all kinds of different things. We don't expect this. Now, for just a moment, if you look at classical Christian education, what was one of the giant barriers, and still is a barrier, that I had to climb over in trying to understand it, was that for literally thousands of years, education wasn't about information. Now those folks ended up knowing a lot of stuff. They were bright folks. Whatever view you may have of ancient and medieval people, they were bright folks. Okay? Just because they didn't have cell phones doesn't mean they were bright folks. Okay. But education was about how do I become a different kind of person? What is the New Testament particularly written in? It's an ancient book. It's written with the perspective about learning that the people of that time had about learning. And why do you learn? So that you can acquire knowledge. So why do you acquire knowledge? So that I can make really good choices in life and live well, which we call wisdom. That's what it's about. If I make enough of those and they become a habit, I become virtuous. I become the kind of person that the New Testament seems to be talking about. I start to become a changed person. Okay? And so the education process was always about character, about becoming thinkers, about people who were able to make wise choices because of the knowledge they had, that they owned, that was theirs, that they had considered deeply. That was the church. And what did the church have? It had a profound salt and light effect on the world. What are we not having today? Certainly I know there's isolated examples of this, there's always exceptions to all of these things. Okay, but in general, we're not being salty and we're not being lighty in the world around us. Okay? And it's not because it's not good people, and it's not because they don't care, and it's not because there's a lot of activity. There is. All those things are true. But somehow there's something just like in schools. Because to take us all the way back to the beginning of this thing, Moreland makes a statement in the book that we are in the most anti-intellectual time in history. I know the very first time I saw that, and I read the book when it first came out, got to go hear him speak about the book when it first came out, and I heard this phrase and that doesn't make any sense. There are more people going to school than have ever gone to school in history. There are more people going to school longer than have ever went in history. You know, people go to school all the time. How in the world could we be? Isn't what school produces intellectuals? So we're in an anti-intellectual, and it took me a long time. In fact, I had to go to a different book. This James Sire, and some of you may know the name, Universe Next Door, is known for worldview studies, and he wrote a book really at a very similar time. It's the only other book out there that I know of. These two books are very similar to each other. In fact, Sire references this book. And he kind of came at it from a different idea, habits of the mind. But he said that there's something different, and let me, if I can. This is his conclusion after his study. He said, well, what is it that ancient medievals, what did they think an intellectual was? And after a couple chapters, this is his conclusion. An intellectual is one who loves ideas, is dedicated to clarifying them, developing them, criticizing them, turning them over and over, okay, seeing their implications, stacking them atop one another, arranging them, sitting silent while new ideas pop up and old ones seem to rearrange themselves, playing with them, pursuing them punning their terminology, laughing at them, watching them clash, picking up the pieces, starting over, judging them, withholding judgment about them, changing them, bringing them into contact with their counterparts in other systems of thought, think other worldviews, inviting them to come to dine and have a ball, but also suiting them for service and workaday life. A Christian intellectual is all of the above to the glory of God. And the more I thought about that, the more, how do you do that? Certainly it's not by lecturing at people. How do you have discussions? And the more I tried to learn about at least certain styles of Socratic, not all Socratic is the same, but certain styles of Socratic instruction, it was that you played with these ideas. You're tearing them apart. What did I see happening in the classroom is, I literally had one student say, I like this philosophy class because I get to disagree with people. And then they tell me why they think what they think, and I get to tell them what I think, and then we keep at it, and we can come to an agreement that's different in the middle, that was different than both of us thought. And I was like, man, what a great summary for what I was observing going on, is that we are learning together, and as we learn together, as we play with these things, we're being intellectuals, according to the historical definition of the word. But in the modern sense, we're not. Therefore, what is Moreland saying? We're anti-intellectual in this. We're not engaging in learning in such a way that it develops thinkers and developing character. We're not doing it. And no matter how we go at it, if we keep using the same methodology, the same pedagogy, if we want to sound fancy, we keep doing it the same way, we're going to get the same result. And that result is not producing saltiness and lightiness in the culture. It's just not doing it. And so that's sort of how I would start this class for you all, is to think about that. That's what we want to try to do. Now, we want to try to engage in a process that helps us start to see the learning process differently. Not because I talk about it, or somebody else talks about it, or Moreland talks about it, but because we experience it. We actually engage in it. That we engage in ideas that we don't understand to begin with. But that's okay, because we're going to do battle with them, and we'll tear them apart and put them back together, and each time we put them back together, we'll put it together with a few more Lego pieces involved, and a few more Lego pieces involved, and pretty soon we'll be thinking at a level that's really quite different than we were to begin. But it's because we're playing with it. But ultimately, why are we doing this? Because we, and Moreland, as you start to get into chapter 2 and get into more of this, he's really going to go after this. We want to actually engage in a process that allows us to be transformed by the renewing of our lives. We want to become people who are able to be wise in discerning the will of God, which is the end of Romans 12:1 and 2. Okay, we want to become people of wisdom. Okay, and it's not one example I always pops into my head when I say this, but when I was in the Army, after 4 years at Biola, I was definitely came to the conclusion I was not in Kansas anymore. For if you've been in the military, you have an idea what I mean by that. And it was a challenging time. And I'd been at the assignment I'd been at for about 2 years at that point. And we were functioning, my wife and I, and some friends were at a camp that was nearby, friends from college, and they invited us to come and visit them for a day up at the camp. And the speaker was actually a professor from Biola, and was very good. And we go, oh, okay, let's sort of slid it into our schedules, and we got up there, and it was really pretty nice break for a few hours. And we went to the evening presentation, and after, at this point, 2.5 years of the Army, this was like breathing, someone putting oxygen mask on you, it was him teaching, he was so good, I hadn't heard somebody like that in a long time. And it was really good, and what he said really made sense to me, and I was motivated. I wanted to do what he said, and got up and started to walk out, and then, as I normally put it, my wife could tell you long stories about this, but my silly, pragmatic, science-trained mind has to go to the mechanics. How do you do it? And the more I thought about it driving home, the more I thought about it, I don't know how to do that. I want to do it. I value and understand the importance of these biblical ideas he was talking about, but I don't know how to do them. I don't know how to grow into them and become that. It won't work just enough to say it. It won't work just enough to hear him talk about it, because I've been there and done that. Okay, and that started me on the quest that's led to some of what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. But it is, how do we actually engage in an active learning process that allows Romans 12, 1 and 2 to happen? Or if you go to 2 Corinthians 10, 5, in that area, several verses there. How do we tear down anti-God ideas in our thinking and build up godly ideas in our thinking? How do we become people who are like Jesus Christ, formed in the image of Jesus Christ? How does that happen? How do we become people who truly are going to affect the world for Jesus Christ? And for me, it wasn't enough to just keep saying it in class and hoping that students would somehow change. Because as I saw them years later, they hadn't changed that much. And I just wasn't satisfied with that. There had to be some better way to do all of this. All these hours we're spending with them, we should be able to accomplish so much more. And that's the journey of the last 20 years or so of my educational experience, has been engaged in learning more and more about this. I continue to learn more and more about it. I think you could live several lifetimes. The early part of the Old Testament folks they had, I've often thought, who would want to live 300 or 400 years old? My body's getting to be a pain in the neck now, and I haven't made it to 100. I haven't made it to 80, but I didn't make it to 70, but I didn't make it to 80 yet. But man, if you had several hundred years to learn these things, you could actually learn something with that much time. That would be actually kind of cool. I get that. I don't know that that's going to happen, but how can it be done in such a way that you can pass it from one generation to another generation? And that's really hard, because you can't control it at all. It has to be something that happens in them, and they're able to then take it in their own unique way and do that. And it's got to be learning that is flexible, that they are learning to become a certain kind of person, because their lives are going to be different than whatever, doesn't make any difference what you say, what your experience has been, what you deal with in a class or deal with in a service. Their life's going to be different. And they've got to be able to take what they're learning and have it be of value to them to be able to make wise choices in that different life that they're living in. And that's what I hope we can do, is to get some thoughts rolling on this over the next few weeks. I recognize that having an afternoon in the summer is a difficult thing to do, and if you're not here, don't worry, feel free to come back the next week or 2 weeks later or whatever happens. Please be reading. I have found this book has had a huge effect on me over the years. I've read it a number of times now. And I encourage you to read it. Don't expect that you're going to understand everything he's talking about the first try to do great, but don't. And certainly I'll give these out part by part so that you get some questions that will help you. And then you'll see this time here is start to become more about variations of these questions, more than just all this background stuff, which is pretty much what the goal is. Okay, thoughts, questions, observations, your interactions if you had a chance to start reading the book, thoughts on what we've been talking about here today. Just your time to talk for a few minutes, yes.
Don't want to get off on any kind of rabbit trail, but I find the current discussion about artificial intelligence and the comparison with actual intelligence and knowledge just enlightening, and people are having to face things.
Yeah.
I remember long ago when I was involved, and it was simple neural nets with, maybe 1,000 parameters instead of the billions of parameters. But back then, even then, it would arrive at an answer, but you could not determine how it got to that answer. It had a fact, but it didn't have any kind of knowledge to it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you. In biology classes for many years, I've had a little segment on it where we have been playing with the growing generations of AI and what is AI really intelligence, and then trying to connect it to some of these kind of things. And it's an interesting discussion. You can learn a lot from it.
It's scary.
Yeah, yeah, it can be. It certainly can be. Especially when we start using things we don't understand. That's really the scary part.
Well, the scary part is the younger generations accepting their intelligence as truth
Yeah.
without thought.
And that's, and we can poke at that issue forever and not have an impact on
Oh,
it.
no, yeah.
What we have to do is we have to come in underneath it. I call it layers. We're having a, that's a fun discussion. I love that discussion. But I call that like a 20 or 30 floor discussion. And what I've learned is you gotta get down as close to the bottom floor as you can in the learning process. And you spend a lot of time understanding those basics, the first floor, the second floor, the third. If you understand those, which in education terms are called the great ideas, if you understand those great ideas well, okay, you find that all of a sudden you can start thinking about these things in a way that you might actually figure out some of them. Whereas if you look at the discussions that go on the 20th floor, the 50th floor of the building, I mean, they're interesting discussions. And there's certainly some people that are really bright, engaged in these discussions. But they don't solve anything, they just talk to each other. Because the solution isn't in the details up there. The solution is in ideas that are down here. And that's what we, as people, need to know, and that's what we need to be passing on to the next generation. Other thoughts?
Does it really transform people's lives? Not just kids. What about believers in general?
Especially old believers.
Yeah.
What do you mean by what? You said what transforms, what do you mean by what?
Does this type of class that we're going to be engaging in, the forms of learning that you've discovered, you said you like data.
Okay.
Have you found data that verifies
Well, even,
transform lives?
I'll comment on that. Just even for me being in high school, I was one of those honor students, top of my class, this and that. I could fill in all the blanks. After high school, I didn't know how to study the Bible. I didn't know how to, because I went to class, I read the chapter, I filled in the study guide. I could answer every question on the test, but I didn't know how to study. So then transferring that to like a church thing, I read the chapter in the Bible. I could tell you what it was, but I didn't know what it meant. And so as I've grown and even learned at school classically this and that, it's like, So even in my own life, I've seen a change from just learning stuff to being able to talk about it and discuss it. And
Huge effect. Yeah, I mean, for me, if you apply some of the stuff I said earlier, I love to read and I love to learn. So in that sense, you could say I'm a theory person, but really when it comes down to it, I'm not a theory person in the true sense. I need data. I want to see examples, and I am very science trained, so I learned by trial and error. So a great deal of what I've learned is by trying it and making mistakes and seeing it not work and then trying something different. The best way that I can relate to that is to give student examples of the learning process. We concluded in our school, I could talk until I was purple trying to convince faculty or parents or the general community that what we were doing really made some sense. And if you have not operated in the early days of classical Christian in a community that isn't super intellectual to begin with, that was a tough sell. It was a tough sell. I don't know why the Lord had a problem so I could learn something. Another one of those 2x4s. But we finally concluded that the only way that we were going to convince anybody of anything was within the students ourselves, within the students. What the results that came from what we did. And we had to trust that what we were doing was going to produce a result in students that would produce. So I learned to look for that, so I can tell stories all day long. But one of our early skeptic students who was not in these kind of classes to begin with. We were big enough to have more than one section of things, and but she was recommended to come in, and she had heard people there seemed like they were having fun, whatever they were doing over there in those classes where they talked all the time. So she joined the class, and she was during her junior year and then her senior year, and she was one of the skeptics that she said, well, this is, I call it a Christian thought class, but she called it a Bible class. And she says, a Bible class, we should be just studying the Bible. Don't we do that? But we don't do it all the time. We do all these other things. And she would come up and she would comment and she'd make editorial comment and do all these things. And she was a good student. She did well. But she was always very active in saying, well, we should just be studying the Bible, not all these other things. Then, right towards the end of her senior year, she came to class one day. You could tell this was really going to be painful. She stuck her hand out and she said, I'm always saying stuff I know. And I have just had the following experience, and so I guess I need to say this. And she described it. My mom is going to, I always forget the name of it, but it's the women's Bible study where they get really in deep into things. There's a lot of presentation.
Bible study fellowship.
Yeah, I think it's that, but I always forget. But anyway, and she was working on answering the questions in her workbook, and she said, I don't understand. The mom was saying this, I don't understand how to do this. So she said to her daughter, Melissa, I've been sending you to a Christian school for a couple of years. You should be able to help me out. Come help me out. Melissa, you really didn't know her, but she was probably just laughing. Ha! Nah, but I'll try. So she read this long section in scripture, and she's looking at the questions, and she goes, oh, here, I think this is what this question is asking, and here's how it connects to these verses here. And then she went on and explained the whole thing. And her mom just sat back and looked at her and said, man, you should teach the class. That you connected all the pieces together on this thing. You made it make sense. That was amazing. And apparently it happened another couple times, and Melissa she was not going to cough up that this was going on. But finally she coughed and said, I guess I have to admit, we've been learning something. So that was one of the skeptic stories. The other stories come of people that I've gotten. I've either had a chance to watch them, or they've sent me messages back from college and even with their families on what's happened with them, with their families. And that's the stuff I was looking for. What happens over the long run? And it's really exciting to see. Does it happen with everybody? I wish I could say it does, but it doesn't. But it really, it changes changes the kind of student that is there. We, for a little dinky place in the middle of nowhere, placed a higher percentage of students from our little school in the Torrey Honors program at Biola than any other school. We're at 3,000 and we had 100, you know, at one time. You call academic results, we used the category so we could use real data that people understood, that we had what is called in California CIF, but state athletic competitions. And our teams were good. We went to the finals within our region a couple times in basketball, and we had pretty good teams. They weren't fantastic, we weren't the best, but we were pretty good. But we came up with this category. See, we discovered that CIF, the State Athletic Federation, had an academic competition. And so you took the grade point averages of any given team, averaged them together, and you compared them statewide. And at one point, there was only one other school of any size in the state that had more winners in different sports in those categories than our school. And it was multiple sports, girls and guys, all there, that was their thing. They would go recruit the really good students and turn them into athletes so that they could get the grade point average. But they actually did that too. But it was that, so we were producing pretty soon we got a report back from one of the parents that their student had gone to, was accepted to a college in the Midwest. And when they were talking to the admissions people after they had been accepted, they go, oh, wow, as soon as we found out that your daughter came from Apple Valley Christian School, we automatically accepted her. But you're in the Midwest, do you even know what wow, we're not exactly sure where Apple Valley is, but we know that we have interacted with students from that school, and all of them are outstanding students, outstanding people. And so we have this group of colleges in the upper Midwest that if it comes from this school, we'll just accept it.
Wow.
You know, so it is, really it's the life changes that I'm really more interested in, but I'm giving stats. Those are things you can get stats on. But yeah, we saw it. Were we perfect? Far from it. Far from it. But we got some really great results.
Well, that's the thing we said earlier was that you'd done 10 years doing the science teaching, you know, said decent education, lots of time and energy was put into it, but you were totally dissatisfied with the results. And it was the life transformational results that you're dissatisfied with. Did you find what you are satisfied with?
That's a loaded question.
Of course it is.
All of these questions he's asking me are loaded. I don't really know where he's wanting me to go. I have to decide if I want to go there. But part of why that's a loaded question is because I'm probably never satisfied.
Right.
So I know there's so much more that could be done, and so much more that could be learned, and I sometimes despair a bit that I'm getting too old, that I'm not going to have time to learn it all, which I've accepted, but still frustrates me sometimes. Did we see long-term results that were life change results? Yes, in all kinds of areas, all kinds of things. And we're at 3:30, so I'm gonna not give examples.
Right.
Maybe some of them will come up over the next weeks, but kids that just had amazing things happen, homeschooling their kids, changing schools, pastors in churches. We have a whole series of doctors and nurses that are out there that are having effects all over the place. But the key thing is what has happened in their life and what they're doing with their families. And that's really what I was after. It's always a little different from kid to kid, but one was about a year or two ago from someone I didn't even expect. And he said, I just wanted to let you know, I know you haven't heard from me in years, but I am now, I don't even know what he's the top fireman in the city that he lives in Arizona. So there was that chief, okay? He said, so I've done okay. But I was trying to think about this whole process and where did it, when I was in high school, when I first started at your school, he was a very bright student. But as many bright students do, they become cynics about school and they're bored to death and, you know, all this kind of. He says, you got my attention, particularly in his case, I got his attention in physics. And you got my attention and you got me to start thinking about things. And he said, it just started a mushroom effect and this is what happened. And I hadn't thought about it in years and I started thinking about it and I saw the pieces of this over years go together and it started all the way back there. We had an international student from Germany who came to our school. It was from German students who were great fun because they loved to argue with you. So we could have great discussions and he did not become a Christian while he was at our school. But he became very good friends with one of our students that was a sharp student. And he went back to Germany and they kept in communication over. And about 2 years later I got an email from this student that was one of our students that graduated from our school. I just heard from, and I forget his name right now, in Germany, and he said, he just became a Christian. And so I had to go, well, what happened? And he said, it's those discussions in Watson's class, they get stuck in your head and you can't get them out. And it's eventually, I finally couldn't refute it anymore. I argued with it for a couple years. I couldn't refute it anymore. And so he then trusted Christ as his Savior. And then they followed up and he grew from there. But I mean, I could go on with stories like this. So yes, it does. Is it universal? I guess if we got really good enough, we probably could be close to universal, but I'm not that good. So.
Right. And that's why I was loading the questions is because these, you know, John knows I'm usually going 100 miles an hour some direction, right? But I think the last time we talked, we're really asking the question, can we use what John learned in the classroom to transform church? You know, I believe it's a legacy for Christian education to be passed on, to take ground and not lose it and reinvent. But the bigger question we have to ask are, if these principles actually cause life transformation, one of the biggest challenges in church is actual life transformation, right? And so I think what we want to really explore in this is what we learn through the journey. How can we use this to actually help people become more like Christ and to have a life that reflects his goodness and kingdom or virtue? So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again next week, and we'll just keep on plowing along. Please do read the book as much as you can.
So our assignment is read as much of the book as we can.
As much as you can. We're dealing with chapter 1 this week.
Okay.
And we'll play with it a little bit more, but we will start to go into chapter 2 next week, which goes into the whole biblical basis for this, and that's really valuable. So,
But if we can read the whole book.
you can read the whole book, sure.
Okay.
I'm over
There's your assignment, the whole book.
Yeah.
Read as much as you can.
No, I went down chapter 2. Did you finish it?